Hello everyone and welcome to my channel Y&R Trends. Nick's breath came shallow and ragged as the antiseptic sting of the hospital room mixed with the copper taste of blood at the back of his throat, the steady beep of the heart monitor sounding less like reassurance and more like a countdown. And as Sharon gripped his hand with white-knuckled desperation while Victor stood rigid at the foot of the bed, eyes blazing with a fear he refused to name, Nick forced himself to speak because time was slipping away and the truth was a living thing clawing at his chest, demanding release, and with every ounce of strength left in him he rasped that Matt wasn't acting alone, that the ally everyone feared was not the real monster, that the real terror wore a familiar face and hid in plain sight, someone who had laughed with them, toasted victories with them, sworn loyalty to the Newmans while quietly sharpening the knife meant for their backs. And Nick's eyes flicked toward the door as if even the walls could be listening, his voice dropping to a whisper as he revealed that Matt's ally wasn't just a partner in crime but a puppet master bound by something darker than greed, guilt, obsession, and a secret buried so deep it had poisoned every choice they'd made for years, because this ally believed Nick knew the truth about a death that was never an accident, a fire that was never electrical, a disappearance that was carefully staged to look like fate when it was actually murder. And Nick coughed violently, blood staining the sheets as he gasped that the ally had been at the center of it all, pulling strings through shell companies, false identities and carefully planted evidence, using Matt as both shield and sword. And as Sharon sobbed and begged him to stop talking, Nick shook his head, tears streaking down his own face as he insisted they had to know. Because once he was gone there would be nothing to stop what was coming, nothing to stop the ally from finishing the plan that began years ago with a stolen file and a forged signature that shifted power, money and lives. And Victor demanded a name, his voice cracking for the first time as a father rather than a titan. But Nick said he couldn't say it out loud, not here, not with cameras and ears everywhere, only that the ally was someone Victor trusted with everything, someone who had access to Newman's security, medical records, and even the hospital itself, someone who had already tampered with evidence and rerouted messages. And Nick's fingers twitched weakly as he pressed them against Sharon's palm in a desperate attempt to pass along more than words, memories flooding his fading consciousness, late-night meetings overheard, a burner phone hidden behind a loose brick, a coded phrase repeated too often to be coincidence, "The debt still stands," a phrase that haunted Nick now because it was proof of a pact sealed with blood, and he whispered that Matt wasn't the one who ordered the hit, that Matt was expendable, manipulated by an ally who believed the Newmans owed a debt that could only be paid in loss, humiliation and death. And Victor staggered back as the realization hit him like a physical blow. His mind racing through faces, allies, rivals, confidants, every person who had ever smiled while plotting, and Nick cried out suddenly, clutching his chest as the monitor shrieked in protest. Yet even then he forced the words out, warning them that the ally had a contingency plan already in motion, a final move triggered by Nick's death that would frame an innocent and crown the real villain as savior. And Sharon begged him to tell her who, just tell her. But Nick could only shake his head and gasp that the proof was hidden where the ally would never look again, somewhere tied to Nick's past, somewhere only family would think to search. And as nurses rushed in and doctors shouted orders, Nick locked eyes with Victor and mouthed three silent words that shattered him. Trust no one. Before his body went still, the beeping of the monitor flattening into a single unbroken tone that echoed like a scream through the room, leaving behind not just grief but terror. Because Nick's final revelation wasn't just that Matt had a terrifying ally, it was that the ally was already inside their circle, already mourning with them, already preparing to strike again. And as Genoa City slept unaware, the secret Nick died to protect began to burn like a fuse, promising that his death was only the beginning of a nightmare that would tear apart families, expose buried sins, and force everyone left behind to question every alliance they had ever trusted. The night Nick died refused to end, stretching into a suffocating limbo where grief and paranoia fused into something far more dangerous. And as dawn threatened the horizon over Genoa City, Victor Newman stood alone in the hospital chapel staring at a flickering candle that cast monstrous shadows across the walls. Nick's last words, "Trust no one," echoing in his skull with every labored breath, because suddenly every memory felt contaminated, every alliance suspect, every smile potentially rehearsed. And when Sharon collapsed into a chair outside the ICU with Faith clinging to her side and Noah pacing like a caged animal, Victor realized with brutal clarity that Nick hadn't just died. He had detonated a truth bomb that would poison them all unless it was defused quickly, quietly, and with absolute precision. Yet the terrifying part was that Nick had taken the name to the grave, leaving behind only fragments, riddles, and a warning that suggested the enemy wasn't coming but already here, already embedded in the very systems meant to protect them. And as Victor replayed Nick's final moments, he remembered the way Nick's eyes had flicked toward the ceiling, toward the vents, the cameras, the invisible network humming above them, and Victor understood that Newman's security had been compromised long before this night, meaning Matt's ally had anticipated every move, every safeguard, every contingency, and had still managed to orchestrate Nick's silencing with surgical cruelty, which meant this wasn't a crime of passion or revenge but a long game rooted in something ancient and unresolved. And as Victor left the chapel and strode down the corridor, his phone vibrated with a message from an unknown number containing just 4 words. The debt still stands. His blood ran cold, because Nick had spoken those exact words only hours earlier, confirming that the ally wasn't hiding anymore but daring Victor to see them, daring him to make the wrong move. And when Victor demanded an immediate lockdown of Newman Enterprises, rerouting of all internal access codes, and a silent audit of every employee with clearance above level 3, he noticed the hesitation on the face of the very man he'd trusted for decades to keep the family safe, a hesitation so brief it could be dismissed as shock. But Victor had built empires by noticing what others ignored, and as the man nodded and walked away, Victor felt the ground shift beneath him, because suspicion had finally found a face even if he wasn't ready to name it yet. And elsewhere in Genoa City, Matt sat in a dimly lit interrogation room nursing a smirk that didn't quite reach his eyes as Chance pressed him for answers, unaware that Matt had already been abandoned, because the ally Nick had warned them about had always intended Matt to take the fall, had always known he was reckless enough to be caught and arrogant enough to believe he was protected. And as Matt scoffed and claimed innocence, insisting Nick had confessed to paranoia before his death, a flicker of fear crossed his face when Chance mentioned a burner phone recovered near the scene, because Matt knew that phone wasn't his, knew it belonged to someone far more powerful who had promised him immunity, and the realization that the ally might sacrifice him without hesitation tightened around his throat like a noose. While at the Newman Ranch, Nicky wandered into Nick's room as if pulled by an unseen force, touching the books he never finished, the jacket still hanging by the door, and when she reached beneath the mattress and felt the edge of something hard taped to the frame, her heart nearly stopped, because Nick had said the proof was hidden where only family would look, and with trembling hands she pulled free a flash drive labeled only with a single letter, which meant nothing and everything all at once, and as she plugged it into her laptop, files bloomed across the screen revealing encrypted videos, financial records, and a single audio file dated years earlier, a recording of a heated argument where a voice Nicky recognized instantly, one she trusted, one she loved in a complicated, lifelong way, threatened Nick with ruin if he ever spoke about what really happened the night a certain fire claimed a life that was supposed to stay buried forever. And Nicky's scream echoed through the empty room as the truth finally clawed its way into the light, because the ally wasn't just close to the Newmans, they were family adjacent, emotionally intertwined, protected by history and shared secrets. And when Victor arrived moments later and saw Nicky's face, he knew before she said a word that Nick's warning had come true, that the monster was not an outsider but someone who had sat at their table, toasted their victories, and sworn loyalty while quietly plotting their destruction. And as Nicky whispered the name she'd heard on the recording, Victor's world tilted, rage and grief colliding into something volcanic. Yet even then he understood they couldn't act openly, not yet, because the ally had planned for exposure, had contingency files, scapegoats, and narratives ready to deploy. And sure enough, within hours the media exploded with a carefully crafted story implicating an innocent employee in a massive financial betrayal tied to Nick's death, painting the ally as a hero who had uncovered the truth. And Sharon watched the coverage in horror as puzzle pieces snapped into place, realizing Nick had been trying to protect someone else even as he was dying, someone who would now be crushed under the weight of a lie. And as Faith asked through tears why Uncle Nick had to die, Sharon vowed silently that his final gift, the truth, would not be wasted, even if it meant burning Genoa City to the ground to expose it. And as night fell again, Victor stood at Nick's grave long after everyone else had left, the wind howling like a warning through the trees, and he spoke aloud for the first time since Nick's death, promising his son that he would finish what Nick started, that he would unmask the ally, dismantle the empire built on blood and betrayal, and make sure the debt Nick spoke of was paid in full, because in Genoa City secrets never stayed buried forever, they only waited for the right moment to rise, and Nick's terrifying revelation had set that moment in motion. ensuring that his death was not an end but the opening act of a reckoning that would leave no one untouched. The day after the funeral dawned under a sky the color of bruised steel, and Genoa City moved as if underwater, every whispered condolence and lowered gaze carrying the weight of Nick's absence. Yet beneath the surface a war had already begun, silent and merciless, because Victor Newman did not mourn the way other men did. He strategized, and as he stood in his study at the ranch staring at the flash drive Nicky had hidden inside a hollowed-out book, he understood that Nick's final gift was not just proof but leverage, the kind that could collapse reputations and expose decades of carefully curated lies if deployed with precision. And while Nicky paced behind him fighting the urge to shatter something, anything, Victor dissected the files one by one, finding patterns in the financial transfers that pointed to shell corporations layered like armor, medical records accessed under false pretenses, and security overrides issued at impossible hours, all signed off by someone whose authority made questioning them unthinkable, someone whose name had become synonymous with loyalty. And as Victor's jaw tightened, he realized the ally had built their power not through force but through trust, weaponizing proximity and history until betrayal became invisible. And at the same time across town Sharon sat alone in the crimson lights after closing, Nick's jacket folded beside her like a relic, replaying every conversation from the past year with merciless clarity. Noticing now the interruptions, the warnings cut short, the way Nick had flinched whenever a certain name came up, and she remembered the coded phrase, "The debt still stands," and how Nick had said it once with a bitterness she'd never heard before. And as realization dawned, Sharon understood that Nick had been living with the terror of exposure, not for himself but for someone else he was trying to protect, someone who would now be destroyed if the truth came out, and that knowledge twisted her grief into resolve, because if Nick had sacrificed himself to buy time, then time was a currency she would spend wisely, even if it meant deceiving the very people she loved. While at the police station Chance reviewed the burner phone data again and again, growing increasingly uneasy as he traced calls that looped back into Newman Enterprises' internal network, calls that should have triggered alarms but didn't, and when he quietly approached a superior with concerns, he was shut down with an efficiency that told him this went higher than he'd feared, forcing Chance to confront the possibility that justice itself had been compromised. And meanwhile Matt sat in his cell staring at the concrete wall as the bravado finally cracked, because the promised lawyer never arrived, the immunity never materialized, and when a guard slipped him a message that read "You were always the fall guy," Matt felt true terror for the first time, realizing that the ally Nick had warned them about was already rewriting the narrative, positioning Matt as the sole architect of everything. And in a moment of desperate clarity Matt demanded to see Victor, knowing it was his only chance to survive. While at the ranch Victor received a visit he hadn't expected, someone close enough to knock without calling first, someone whose presence sent a ripple of controlled shock through the room, because the ally had decided to move openly now, cloaked in grief and righteousness, offering condolences, offering help, offering to stand shoulder to shoulder with Victor to find justice for Nick. And Victor played his part perfectly, welcoming them in, matching sorrow with sorrow, rage with rage, all while cataloging every gesture, every hesitation, because predators recognized predators. And as they spoke the ally casually mentioned an internal investigation they'd initiated to protect the family, a move so audacious Victor nearly smiled, because it confirmed what Nick had died to tell them, that the ally believed they were untouchable. And as the ally left, Nicky whispered that she couldn't stand another second of pretending, but Victor reminded her that the most dangerous moment was when the enemy believed they had won. And as night fell, Sharon received a text from an unknown number with a single image attached. Nick, weeks before his death, meeting secretly with someone whose face was deliberately obscured, and 3 words beneath it. He chose wrong, sending a chill through her bones because it was a message meant not just to threaten but to recruit, to force her into silence through fear. Yet instead it ignited something defiant inside her, and she forwarded it to Victor without comment, while elsewhere Chance finally made a choice that could cost him his career, secretly copying the phone records and delivering them to Victor under cover of darkness, confirming that Nick's final hours had been monitored in real time by someone with godlike access. And when Victor compared the timestamps with hospital security logs, the final piece slid into place, revealing that Nick's room had been accessed minutes before the fatal turn by someone whose clearance should have made them invisible. And as Victor closed his eyes, grief finally cracked his armor, because the betrayal wasn't just strategic, it was personal. a wound that reached back years to moments of shared victory and mutual survival, and by morning the plan was set, subtle and devastating, beginning with Matt's sudden transfer to protective custody under Newman influence, followed by a controlled leak to the media that contradicted the Allies' carefully crafted narrative, forcing them to react, and react they did, launching an aggressive public campaign that painted Victor as a grieving father losing his grip, but Victor countered with silence, knowing the truth didn't need volume, it needed timing, and as Sharon confronted the person Nick had been protecting, begging them to run, to hide, to save themselves, she was met with tears and denial because the ally had convinced them they were safe, that Nick's death was tragic but necessary, and that realization broke Sharon's heart all over again, yet she left with a promise to Nick echoing in her chest, and when the day of reckoning finally came it arrived not with sirens but with a press conference, where the Allies stood flanked by officials declaring a breakthrough, only for Victor to appear unannounced, flash drive in hand, eyes burning with a calm fury that silenced the room. And as the first recording played, raw, undeniable and damning, the Allies' mask slipped in real time, panic flickering across their face as years of manipulation unraveled, and though the fallout would take months, trials would drag on, and wounds would never fully heal, one truth became inescapable in that moment. Nick Newman had not died in vain, because his terrifying secret had forced the darkness into the light. And as Genoa City reeled from the exposure, alliances shattered and new ones formed from the ashes, ensuring that Nick's legacy would not be his death, but the reckoning it unleashed, a reckoning that proved even the most powerful monsters could bleed when the truth finally spoke.